how to answer exam questions on Caroline Duffy's poetry. If I click my fingers, you can see the top descriptors, band answers for an A grade. They say that they want a sophisticated critical perception in response to an interpretation of a text. Okay, sophisticated basically means beyond the obvious. You've got to be saying something which is beyond perhaps what you've been given even by your teacher, beyond what you see in things like Spark Notes. It has to be your own thoughts. Critical, this means that you have to have been analytical, basically. You must have thought carefully and broken down the language and analysed it in depth. And it's in response to an interpretation of. So they're expecting a response from you from the text. They want to feel what you think about the text when they read an essay. An interpretation, so they've got to see some sort of valid interpretation, some sort of your own thoughts of what you think the poem's about. They also want a cogent and precise evaluation of relevant detail from the text. This basic cogent means clear and often concise as well, and precise, so they don't want too much waffle. Okay, in an answer, 2 or 3 pages perhaps will do, and it's an evaluation of relevant detail. So that's, you're making judgments about how successful a writer is. We'll look at this more when we look at the exam question. And then assessment objective 2 is a sensitive understanding of the significance and effects of a writer's choice of language, structure and form. Sensitive, well, again it's back to this sophisticated issue, beyond the obvious, something that shows that you've really responded personally to it and you thought about the significance of the language, what effect it has upon you. The structure and form, often structure and form go together, the shape of a poem, the ways in which it orders its points. You need to have text which is legible, its meaning is very clearly communicated and your grammar is perfect. Let's look at this question in Mrs. Tilcher's class. We've got a question here: how does Duffy vividly convey impressions of being a pupil in Mrs. Tilcher's class? Remember to support your ideas with details from the poem. I would say firstly you need to think about the poem itself. Read it aloud to yourself, to a friend. Feel the poem in your mouth, in the air. Feel the rhythm, the texture of the language. Use your imagination to conjure up the world of a poem. And once you've got that, you're almost certainly going to give an interesting answer if you've really thought about it for yourself. Think, what is the poem about? What world does it conjure? What are the interesting uses of language for you in the poem? I've suggested using the 5 W's plus H as a good way to revise. What is the poem about, as I've already said? Who is speaking? Who is the focus of the poem? When is the poem set? When does the poem change in tone, atmosphere and attitude? Where is the poem set? And how do you know this? Why does the poet use language in this way? And how does the poet interest, fascinate, engage us with its language? What techniques is it using to do this? Okay, so they're all important issues to think about. In Mrs. Tilcher's class, there's a few things I'd like to remind you of. The you in the poem is very interesting because the poet seems to be looking at themselves, don't they, from an older vantage point as an adult, and looking at you, the child. You travelled through Africa, didn't you, in your mind with Mrs. Tilcher. In the second verse we're told the school was better than home, and the poet evokes or conjures or creates in the reader's mind a kind of beautiful image of this primary school classroom, which I found very vivid for me. I was right back there myself. And then the poet later on creates a sense of threat. We have in the second verse Brady and Hindley being smudges on the horizon, just a kind of dark sense of threat in the distance. But then later on the tadpoles turn into frogs, there's a rough boy who is unpleasant to her, there's the talk of sex and how babies are born, and at the very end of the poem there's a sense of rupture, or sense of a break with Mrs. Tilcher. Mrs. Tilcher turns away from the poet when she asks how babies are born. So we have a poem that kind of is very carefully structured as it develops from a sense of the child's wonder at school, moving to the child's sense of disillusionment. The examiner's comments are worth reading about. They say, "It is expected that candidates will warm to the poem, though personal elaborate reminiscences of the good old days will not move beyond low bands." So they're not wanting you to give a great long story about your wonderful time at school. They're wanting you to focus on the poem itself, but give a personal response. There should be some response to the warmth of the description of the lessons and the involvement of the reader from the first word of the poem. You notice the "you" does that, doesn't it? You're brought in, aren't you? It's almost, it could be you, the reader, that's remembering these times. The first verse suggests the fun of being in class. There is a chanting and the laughter of the bell. In the second verse there are suggestions of colour, sweetness, safety from the outside dangers, Brady and Hindley being loved and rewarded. And the inevitable invasion of innocence by experience begins in the third verse. The tadpoles evolve and commas become erect. There is a dunce, there is roughness. The language becomes unattractive. The onomatopoeic croaked and the violence of kicked. And Mrs. Tilcher smiles and turns away as the sky becomes sexy. The thunderstorm of puberty arrives, and the innocent children ask questions that the teachers of 5-year-olds perhaps do not wish to answer. Basic responses will make some relevant comments to the poem with little textual support. They will move through the bands as understanding of the poem becomes clearer, the discussion of its mood and language fuller, and the focus on vividly closer. The best will engage the language and structure of the poem with insight. So the best answers are going to look really closely at the language, and my advice is that you have a good look at the language. My particular tip would be to look carefully at line endings. The way the poet ends a line is very important. It may be an end-stop line or a run-on line, or what we call enjambment. Duffy uses a mixture, running on lines at vital points, making you think again about an idea by running on a line. So for example, look at the last verse. You asked her how you were born. You've got you asked her and then a new line, and you kind of expect, don't you, her to ask a traditional question about what's the capital of such and such a place, but the question is a much more decisive one, isn't it? Much more important one. How you were born. She's looking to see whether the teacher can tell her the truth about this vital question that she's so puzzled and troubled by. And of course the next line is even more interesting, because the teacher, Mrs. Tilcher, turns away and is emphasised by the end of the line, then turned away. So the terrible rejection of the teacher is emphasised by the line ending, isn't it? And the kind of suspense of the question is also emphasised by that line ending. So line endings are really important in poetry. They're really basically what makes something a poem, is the line ending.